Good morning. We had gotten a little ahead of ourselves last week, where we further than I had anticipated us getting, and so we were talking about Luther at the Wartburg. So we'll kind of come back a little bit on talking some of those things. The sheet that you have, that folded sheet this week, it's I wrestle every week of how detailed to go, or how much to go into. We could spend. I've got books. I mean, I've got shelves. Well, there's like three and a half shelves of just Luther's works. But then, the commentaries, the histories. We could do this for a very long time. So to try to summarize. Well, and I had intended to do this before. I had come across this book here, and it's on the inside. It says St. John Lutheran School, Wood Lake. So I don't know if it's in the school library or the teacher books or something like that. It's called Sketches of the History of the Church, from Concordia Publishing House. It doesn't have a date in it. It's in English, but it was printed in Germany. So I don't know I have no idea when it was printed. But it goes through all of church history. That's what you have in front of you. I just copied a couple of pages out of that on this section. We'll use that kind of as our outline to walk through it. We'll see how that works for a while. And allows us to, keep going so we don't get too much into the weeds, but then allow us to stop when we see something that we want to spend a little bit more time with. All right. So where it has us starting off is at the Wartburg. And remember, so this is 1521 into 1522. Remember, it's in the summertime that he's captured, and then he's going to stay there for 10 months until March of the next year. Okay? 10 months he spent in exile at the Wartburg. Here he began the constructive period of his career, and the amount of work that he produced here is amazing, though one may say that the amount of literary work that he turned out at all times is astonishing. He took up the study of Greek and Hebrew more thoroughly, preached many sermons, carried on an enormous correspondence, and here wrote many of his best treatises. I was reading through some of the letters that he's writing while he's at the Wartburg. And initially, he's writing at one of them. It says, "I'm both lazy and very busy." Like he's got this. He doesn't know what to do with himself, but he's working a lot. But then he feels like he's not really doing anything because he's off there by himself. And usually, especially the letters to George Spalatin, a close friend, just about everyone describes his bowel movements. Just about everyone. He had a terrible problem with constipation and digestive issues. And so this is a close friend who probably is asking, how are you feeling? And so, it's not like fine. In detail, how long it's been and, how things were this morning when all the detail as much as you need to know. But if you want to find out, the book of letters, it's all in there. It's a lot of correspondence, and he's writing especially with people back in Wittenberg. What's going on there? Now he's away in hiding. I even read one where he had attached another letter, which was like a decoy letter that he was supposed to kind of let leak, and it was to suggest that he was hiding in Bohemia. Like the letter, like he says, let this one get out, where it says, you may have heard that I was in hiding at the Wartburg. Well, that's silly. They'll never think to look in Bohemia. And so it was kind of like this decoy to try to get them, if they were going to be looking for him, to try to kill him. Where he actually names the place that he actually is. But so what's going on in Wittenberg is going to be a big thing. Well, first though, it says who is here in his Patmos, as he calls it, that reference to Revelation. That's where John was when he wrote the book of Revelation, in exile, so he considers himself in exile, that he completed the translation of the entire New Testament into the German language, which was printed in the year 1522 and spread with almost incredible rapidity throughout Germany, with effects most alarming to the Roman prelates and clergy. And well might they be alarmed, for Luther put into the hands of the people that word of God, which had imbued and fortified him with such overmastering power and strength. And I think later on it talks about the effect of the translation. It might be a little bit oversold at this point as far as the effect. How far did this go? It certainly did when he published it. So he translates it during December through March. So remember, he gets there in the summer. In December, he goes back to Wittenberg for just a couple of days for some meetings. He comes back to take care of things kind of in secret. It's a secret return, just comes back for a little bit. But it's after he gets back from that, and I think he brings more of his books back with him. And that it's during those couple of months, 3 months, that he translates the New Testament into German before he comes back in March. It's done. Or it's so that it's published then in September. And it did. It was, we'll show you some information about that translation. And I don't know if he wrote this during this time, but it related his translating the Bible. He says, I've undertaken to do this. This was good for me, otherwise I would have died in the mistaken notion that I was a learned fellow. All those who think they are learned ought to do some such work. Just the notion of translating, he says, getting these Greeks to speak in German. And later on, even harder to get, David to sing in German, instead of in Hebrew, and trying to make it natural and all this is very, very difficult work. But he does it again. It's published in 1522. Some of it's called the September Testament. It was, let me just give you some details. It was 222 pages, 45 lines per line, no verse divisions. Someone had asked that somewhere. We were talking, maybe it was men's Bible study. We were talking about the verse divisions. When did those come in? And it doesn't mean that they weren't invented yet, that someone hadn't done that in some, but Luther's New Testament didn't have the verse divisions in it at this point.
Did he ever do revisions of it? How you sometimes look at your work?
Yes. Basically the rest of his life. He's revising. I don't know how much of that's the New Testament. The Old Testament, so this is just the New Testament now. Later on, by 1534, we've got another decade plus that he's going to be working before the whole thing is completed, before the whole Bible. But the Old Testament, when he gets back to Wittenberg, he's going to have a whole team of guys working with him in Hebrew to try to get the whole Old Testament done. And I would assume then that some of that revision work also in the New Testament, that this, even though it was published here 1522, it didn't probably say the same. There were multiple editions, and then also that would include revisions that he made. And he kind of did that the rest of his life to try to, which is so interesting that for the most part, after his death, for the most part, I think Luther's Bible translation stays the same. I really should know. I was thinking about this or talking to someone about this not too long ago, and I wondered to myself, is the Bible that our Lutheran brothers and sisters in Germany today, is that still essentially Luther's Bible? I think it is. I don't know for sure. If I'm sure there have been other publications of Bibles, but just in general, broadly speaking, I know in the United States, the Bibles that are, the Bibles that would have been read here by Lutherans here was, for the most part, it was still labeled as Luther's Bible. It wasn't like there was some other translator who's come along since then that's kind of a revision of it, although I'm sure there was, especially in spelling. That's where you'd see a big update. But really, Luther's Bible translation actually solidified German spelling very much. And so it kind of solidified, and the German language as a whole. High German, kind of official German, was very much solidified by Luther's Bible translation. But there's a kind of in contrast to in English where, well, although for a very long time, how long was the King James Bible, 1611, really until, I know that there were ones earlier, but it's like the 60s and 70s where there's just an explosion of translations. The thing where we've got just, any number of them now, that's really pretty recent. Up until then, the King James was pretty standard. Although there were versions of that too. It wasn't totally uniform. Derek, you had a question?
Who translated the version of the Catholics?
Okay, so at that time, that was Jerome. St. Jerome had a Latin translation. So the official, and up until, I think, Vatican II, which is also in the 1960s, and that maybe influenced, the Jerome's Latin Vulgate was the only official translation of the scriptures as far as the Roman Church was concerned. Well, they didn't need to know the Bible. Was kind of that was their, that's what would have been read in church, I believe, until the 1960s. And that translation, Jerome's translation, wasn't a translation. I should know this before I speak. That wasn't necessarily a fresh translation from the Greek and Hebrew. It was probably I'm not exactly sure how he came to it. I'd have to look that up more. But it wasn't, and other translations had already at this time been done in German too. But they were generally translations from Latin into German. So they were one step removed from the original Greek and Hebrew. This is kind of the first complete, full German translation from, and even there were English translations before this that they weren't from Greek and Hebrew. So there's going back to the Greek and Hebrew, which requires learning it and becoming, and his time at the Wartburg is the time that he gets very familiar with it. Yeah. A couple things to share. So there is an extant copy of that first edition, that 1522 edition, and you can buy a facsimile of it. That's what's pictured here. It's a copy. They've scanned it all in and then reprinted and bound it. This copy, and you can see the note. Can you tell that this is the text? This is the body of the text. You see the headers. This is like 1 Peter or 1 Timothy. Sorry, or 2 Yeah, this is 2 Timothy here. An introduction down here. So there's the text, and then everything else handwritten around it are notes by the person who owned the book. You want to know who owned this book? Whose notes those are? It's Johann Graumann. We sang one of his hymns for Hymn Festival, "My Soul Now Praise Your Maker." I got to get my stories right. Johann Graumann. I think he was the guy who was Johann Eck's secretary, was on the opposite side of Luther at the Leipzig debate, and then was convinced by Luther, and then became a Lutheran after that. These are his notes on Luther's, on an extant or original 1522 first edition of. So when he got his hands on this thing, he was. I would love to be able to read that and to know how he took notes on that. I mean, they're everywhere too, like in between the lines, right? And everywhere. Must have been some organization to that somehow. It had artwork in it, woodcuts in there. I think from Cranach. Yeah, and you can see maybe it's no verse numbers here. You have lines though that indicating something, and I don't know if those correspond to our verses. I could look that and see, but there are some, or it could be. There's not a lot of punctuation in there either. I don't see. So maybe those are indicating differences between sentences too. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so you can buy it. You want to guess how much it costs to get a facsimile copy of this? I don't even know, because it's not. They don't even cite a price. You can put in on this website. You can submit a quote to get an estimate, but it says roughly between whatever I did the conversion. It's like $1,000 to $3,000. So have a legit copy there. That's just the New Testament too, remember. All right. We'll talk about Karlstadt here. All right. Next paragraph, Europe at this time was agog with excitement over the rapid turn of events in the last few years. There was the discovery of the new continent in the far west, which to the European nations was just 19 years old when Luther challenged Tetzel. At the Diet of Worms, American natives were exhibited to Charles V. They had brought some over to as an exhibition to the emperor to see what these funny-looking people were that were in America or whatever. At the same time, the humble monk of Wittenberg had defied the whole world by his bold declaration at Worms. The printing press was achieving astonishing results and putting forth a veritable deluge of reading matter in the vernacular. Luther had been addressing the German people in their own language, and practically everybody in Germany knew what the issue meant between Luther and the church. Luther had made startling exposures of the Roman system of corruption and fraud and had resorted to the scriptures for proofs for his statements. The word of God was the paramount issue to him, and he sent out call upon call to the German nation to return to this word, which contained all the principles of Christianity. And to make this principle thoroughly operative among the people generally came the publication of the entire New Testament in the vernacular. We can understand under these circumstances why the New Testament found such rapid circulation throughout Germany. The circulation, I think I've got a note on that somewhere. What did I see? 5,000 copies in a matter, in what was it, in the first couple of months. It sold widely. It was not cheap. It sold depending on the edition. You could get editions. You could get an edition without any binding, so just loose leaf. You could get it up to a fancier edition, and between a half a gulden and then 2 gulden. And it's really hard to know how much that was, because like when they do a conversion, like it'll say something like a gulden was like $15 or something like that. But which doesn't seem like that expensive, but then other descriptions say it was very expensive, and not everyone could afford this. So was it widely available? It did sell, but I'm not sure that people had that kind of expendable income that could just be. So it did sell. I mean, thousands of copies, and then it went through many editions over time. Everybody began to delve into the Word of God to find out whether it was really so, as the monk claimed. And within a short time, the tradesman in his booth, the traveler at the wayside inn, the peasant behind his plow, the servant in the nursery, in short, everyone began to study, to argue with the parish priest, and to cite Bible texts to him, so that the unlearned clergy fled in alarm. And I wonder if that might be a little bit overstated, just how quickly that happened. Only because I don't know the rate of literacy at that time. So like it's now in German. How many people were reading German at this point? Eventually, Lutherans, in the next 10 years, Luther's going to put out a call to start to more widespread education. Generally, because if you went to school to learn to read, you learned not German. You read Latin. So the educated, they knew German then too. So the educated knew German, but they didn't study in German, they studied in Latin. Was there a wide number? So if you didn't go to school where you learned Latin, where did you learn to read German then? The schools you didn't have just German schools. You could maybe learn that at home, but I don't know that was I don't know the details, but eventually they did. And when the schools begin, and you get then another generation that's learning this. So it probably does start with in the universities where everyone can read, and that's probably enough to start this kind of wildfire. That it's like the peasant behind his plow, maybe not yet. Luther writes later on, encouraging people, everyone to have an education. He's really one of the first to advocate for kind of a universal education. He says everyone will go, with the idea that some of them will be competent to be, I mean, he's looking for preachers and pastors, right? He says not everyone will be, but he says everyone will benefit from that education, even though if not all go on to do that. Like it's a training ground for clergy and other people who need it. But even he says even if they don't do that, they'll be suitable for anything then. And the hearts of the common folk laughed with glee at the consternation of the clergy. Now, yeah, so that's an important point when it says they're challenging the priests. The priests weren't all that educated either. Like it's possible that some of them couldn't read either, or perhaps they could, they just had not spent time in the scriptures. And so Luther, this is again later on when he's doing the visitation, he goes around, he's like, I run into these priests, they don't know the 10 Commandments, they don't know the Lord's Prayer. There's sermons on how to grow potatoes or how to they're not based on the scripture at all. And then that's what's gonna light a fire under him to put out the catechisms and so on. The sweet message of the gospel lifted the hearts of the oppressed masses to the warm, balmy air of the new spring, and sigh of relief went up from hundreds of thousands of hearts as that huge engine of fraud and oppression constructed during 1,000 years by an arrogant and perfidious clergy came to a dead stop. The word became a power in the hearts of the people, and no amount of effort on the part of the emperor or pope was able to suppress it. It is not extraordinary that the new and unaccustomed rare air of the Reformation with its freedom should make some men dizzy and giddy. The work of reform was not speedy enough for some people, and it was the extravagant views of some agitators at Wittenberg which finally drew Luther from his seclusion on the Wartburg. A body of students and citizens began to interfere with the worship in the churches and carried on a campaign of destruction of church property. Dr. Karlstadt of the university joined them. So Karlstadt is Luther's colleague there in Wittenberg, and he's one of the preachers, and some of the things that they're trying to sort out what is this new theology, what is it? And how far does it go? How far should these reforms go, and what do we do about them? How do we actually affect the change if there's something wrong? So this first one is referring to the practice of only giving one kind in communion, only and he's only the one who partakes only of the bread sins. That it's a sin to not just to withhold communion on the priest part, to withhold the cup from the laity when Jesus says take drink, and they say no, he didn't add it, whatever, and they forbid that. This is preaching to the people and saying if you're just taking communion in one kind, then that's a sin, when that was never an option before. It burdens the conscience of those. They hadn't worked through how to make that change. They start realizing that that's wrong. Jesus said, take, drink. There's no biblical reason not for communion to be at eating and drinking as Jesus instituted. But how do you make that change? And so some of his rhetoric is going to, now that they're pushing this change, one, before people are kind of ready for it, and also mandating it. So they would force it into force people to receive. He writes about organs, that they only belong to theatrical exhibitions in princes' palaces, and organs even at this time weren't used like we use them. And for some time in the Reformation, that organs weren't used to accompany singing like they began to do eventually. But they were used in the church, and just ornamentation in general. We're going to see, here with images, they're going to everything that smacked of what they would call idolatry, as if every kind of image was an idol. And so Luther's going to eventually address that. They eventually are going to go and they're going to break them all. They're going to go into the church, and I believe the city church, St. Mary's, in Wittenberg, the whole inside was pretty much destroyed. They would kind of, the preaching was agitating people, and then they would get with the students, and university students, you hear about that sometimes, getting kind of fired up for some cause and protesting, or and if you get them, it's not a new thing, or not that's the idea that they could be led easily and can go riled up that way. Painted idols standing on altars are even more harmful and devilish. So they describe statues, and they eventually kind of came in and destroyed this. So that kind of stuff is going on. At the same time, Karlstadt is implementing. I mean, when you read Luther's letters back home, he's like, yeah, it sounds like that you guys are doing the reforms on your own, and I'm kind of proud of you. You don't need me there. But then I think eventually he's starting to hear things that, no, that's too far, or that's too fast, or things like that. So he's addressing some of these.
Luther kind of preached against some of that in a way of going into those idols or damage.
Yes, yeah. I mean, he's going to write, and he's got to kind of make a fine line. He says, if it becomes an idol, it should be destroyed. But just the things themselves are not automatically idols. Statues, images, stained glass, all these things. They're not automatic idols. If they are idols, but and then preaching against the kind of the mob mentality and the riots that were going to be taking place. So you'd have this, and then you'd have the generally it seems in Wittenberg, you had the elector and the leaders of the city were urging caution and putting limits on this kind of stuff, and then the other side kind of riles up, and so that's starting to foment. Well, you've got. I want to come back to that. You've got preaching that is generally good. It's pointing out errors, problems, particularly in the Mass. The text of the Mass, so one of the monks, Gabriel Zwilling, he's preaching, and he talks about abolishing the Mass and calls it an atrocious sin against the divine majesty. But as Luther kind of works through this, and we'll see this in the next few years, because Luther's going to write, and he's going to say, what exactly in the Mass being the liturgy as a whole, but particularly the sacrifice of the Mass. And some of the prayers were false. They had false theology in them. Speaking of the sacrament as really our sacrifice to God, right? And he says that's a false, and that's an abomination. That should be done away with. But he's not going to get rid of all of it. So it's a kind of a classic case of not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That the liturgy itself is the baby. There's false things in there. That's where he's going to get to. But you see, they're trying to figure this out. How far should this reform go? What do we need to remove? Do we need to remove the statues? Do we need to eliminate vestments, candles, processions, you name it, any of the external decoration in the church, in the liturgy? So without him they're pushing forward with some of these reforms, and probably pushing harder and agitating people to get riled up. The monks leaving the monasteries, that too. So Luther admitting that he writes, when he's at the work, he writes to his father this long letter where he kind of goes through and he says, it's interesting because he recognizes that he was wrong to disobey his father, but he's trying to kind of convince his father that in the end, the way it turned out was probably this is the way it had to go. That in the end, this was good. He says that he went to become a monk. He didn't count on becoming basically a pastor and a doctor. And what he ended up doing, it went through the monastery, but he acknowledges that was, I shouldn't have disobeyed you. But now here we are. Yeah. And so that changes. Who's doing the preaching? What are these monks leaving to do? They're abandoning their vows, which Luther is all right with. Many of them are getting, a whole bunch of people get married. The priests and the monks are starting to take wives, and Luther's like, "You think you're going to foist one on me?" Like he's skeptical at this point. He doesn't think that getting married is something that he would ever be interested in. You don't think you're going to try to get me to marry? Just wait. Before we get to the Christmas service, so he does come back. I mentioned this. He comes back just briefly, again, in secret. No one knows that he's there for some meetings to discuss. And he's pleased generally with how things go, that he kind of dealt with some issues that were going on. And then he goes back, brings his books back. He goes, I got to go back to my seclusion. And that's when he gets to work in translating. This is when he sits for Cranach and gets this portrait taken with his beard and everything, showing a very different look. And then, so that's early December. At the end of December, a lot of things happened there. One of them is that they were going to have it on New Year's. It was going to be a service and so they're trying to label what's a new evangelical service, a Lutheran service. And I even read one book somewhere. It says, the first Protestant service was on Christmas Eve, 1522 or 1521. And so describing, this was a communion or a service with, but it got rid of. But it was not what Luther's going to set up later on. It was more of a radical sort of thing. No vestments. I've heard different things. I've heard self-serve communion, like people were told to just come up to the altar and get it. So they're like, okay, what we were doing wasn't right. We knew that there was problems with that, but what does it look like? What is a proper way? Do we need to kind of figure out what the apostles did? Do we need to erase 1,500 years, 1,600 years of history and figure out what the apostles did way back then, and we're going to try to do that way? Is that what we're going to do? Or what? And so, but the other thing I read was that it was it wasn't self-serve, but it was where the chalice especially was forced on people. It was put into their face and they're made to drink, and which caused a great deal of stress. And and then more stuff. So let's keep reading. Let's see, where did I leave off? Karlstadt joined them. Then you got some fanatics from Zwickau increased the agitation by professing new revelations, circulating a doctrine of the internal word, a visible kingdom of Christ on earth, and rejecting infant baptism. The heavenly prophets of Zwickau, they were called, and later were known by the name of Anabaptists, which they came to Wittenberg, these guys from Zwickau, right at the end of December here. And they were only there for a few months. They weren't there by the time Luther gets back. They had been kicked out. I believe they're from Zwickau. They got kicked out of there for some of these radical ideas. A number of them, some merchants, other men. They were just. I mean, you hear about this, right? When there's some kind of protest or something that goes on, or some riot, that there's someone from the outside that comes up, and external agitators that come in and do that. That's what these guys were. But yeah, this idea of an internal word. They were. Luther's going to call them enthusiasts. The German term is Schwärmer. Schwärmerei. That's the word. Well, it's related to our English word swarm, like what bees do. Schwärmer. They swarm. They buzz around, and they're all excited, and they're all trying to do what God has already given in His Word, the means of grace. But they're agitating for a kind of a work of the Spirit, a new thing that God is doing apart from what He's promised in His Word and the means of grace. Sort of a general thing of what's going on here. And he's going to write against these people later on, because they're going to continue agitating. But here, for a few months, they're in Wittenberg, and they're stirring up. So in January 1522, they go in first. I think it's the convent church where like Luther preached, did his first, the convent chapel, whatever. They would break up all the side altars in the thing, just destructive. And eventually they had, and there's the city church, or the city like council is making rules against these things. And I didn't mention this. They said they were going to do that service, that new service on New Year's Eve, but then the city council said, no, you can't do that. So they moved it up. They moved it up to Christmas and did it then instead. So this kind of very, very, very tense. Luther could not sit by idle and see these agitators damage the cause of the Reformation. Despite the injunction of the elector to remain at the Wartburg, he hastened to Wittenberg, reaching home on March 6th, 1522. So previously, like when he came back in December, I think he kind of asked, he's like, is it all right if I just come, under these circumstances, I'm going to go secretly at the end of March. And he had been asking, can I go back? Can I go back? And he kept on saying no. And he's like, this time I'm not asking. I'm coming home. I think he said that somewhere. I don't know if I have that up on here or not. Where he just writes, like to the elector, he says, I'm your cross. I'm coming home. So yeah, they come in January. This is a picture. I was trying to find an example. There are in some of these churches today, and they said even in Wittenberg, you can see it in the structure of the building, some of the damage from those riots. This is not in Wittenberg, but it's somewhere else in Germany. And you just see, like, they just chip the faces off of a relief carving on the side of a wall, and it's just damage done. Yeah, this is what I was talking about. This he says, coming home. There had been a riot in the city related to this, and the city council was putting its foot down. And after this, that's when Luther says, I'm back. He leaves Wartburg on the 2nd of March, arrives back on the 6th. He says, not your fault. If I get hurt, it's on me. I have to come back though. So he comes back, and then he preaches. So on the following Sunday, which was Invocavit Sunday, so the first Sunday in Lent, he began a series of 8 sermons on the duty of the people in these critical times, which breathe the very spirit of tolerance. Not a word of denunciation or the least reference to the leaders of the agitation escaped his lips. Luther's calm presentation of the truth disarmed all opposition, brought the people back to their senses, and kept the movement within the limits of the divine word. The Zwickau agitators were absent when Luther appeared upon the scene. All right, I'm going to, in the time we have left, share with you a little bit from these sermons. So you can see kind of the outline. Interestingly, he doesn't, I don't know when these sermons took place. Were these in the main service, like on the Sundays? I don't know, because they weren't connected to the everywhere else, Luther, you can say, when he preaches on Invocavit, he would be preaching on Matthew 4. When he preaches on Reminiscere, he's going to be preaching on the Canaanite woman, the same lessons that we hear. Luther was preaching on those same readings, but not in these ones. So 8 days in a row, he preaches. They're not super long sermons. If you want to read the whole thing, you could borrow this book if you wanted to. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. One is from his Monday sermon. His Monday sermon, he is talking, generally that's what he's through the whole thing, it's calm down and try to take a kind of a middle road. He says, he says, we are entirely agreed that private masses should be abolished. I wish, as I've said in my writings, I wish they would be abolished everywhere and the ordinary evangelical mass be retained. The private masses, where you had a priest all by himself, no congregation saying these masses, which is why they had these side altars all over, because you'd have the priest saying the mass, and saying the mass carried with it certain merits and things, even though there wasn't anyone communing. It was so the communion wasn't for communing; it was for saying the mass. But he says the ordinary evangelical mass should be retained. Let Christian love should not employ harshness here, nor force the matter. And all the way through, he's saying, okay, we need these changes, but we're not going to force them. We have the right to speak, he says, but not the power to accomplish. We should preach the word, but the results must be left solely to God's good pleasure. Later on, he says, in short, I will preach it, teach it, write it, but I will constrain no man by force, for faith must come freely without compulsion. Take myself as an example. I opposed indulgences and all the papists, but never with force. I simply taught, preached, and wrote God's word. Otherwise, I did nothing. And while I slept or drank Wittenberg beer with my friends Philip and Amsdorf, the word so greatly weakened the papacy that no prince or emperor ever inflicted such losses against it. That quote is used oftentimes where Luther talks about drinking good Wittenberg beer. But he says, like, I preached and then I went home and drank. Not like all night, but what he's saying is like, while I'm not preaching, the word is working. I let the word do the work. I did nothing, the word did everything. Had I desired to foment trouble, I could have brought such great bloodshed upon Germany. Indeed, I could have started such a game that even the emperor would not have been safe. But what would it have been? Mere fool's play. I did nothing, I let the word do its work. Yeah. That's Monday. Tuesday, and talking about how to deal with adiaphora, that these things, like images, they're not commanded, we don't have to have them, but they're not forbidden either. Idolatry is forbidden. And so if we would, so in this sermon, he says, he's talking about the adversaries, they're saying all images are wrong. You can't have any, and they'll say, well, that's what in the commandments, he says, you shall not make any image. He says, when they say that it is the worship of images which is forbidden, not the making of them. It is the worship of images that's forbidden, not the making of them. He says, we must admit that we may have images and make images, but we must not worship them. And if they are worshipped, they should be put away and destroyed. And he gives examples from the Bible, like the bronze serpent. The bronze serpent was an image in the Old Testament, and they were told to look to it. But later on in the Old Testament, they started to worship it as an idol, and then they destroyed it. All right, it's great too. Like, I love the way he finishes the sermon. Like, he's going on, and then it just says, let this be enough for today. He doesn't like sum it up. He's just like, I'm tired. See you tomorrow. On Wednesday, deal with abuses, don't be destructive. Talks about meats, like, if you should be pressed to eat fish instead of meat on Friday, and eat fish and abstain from eggs and butter during Lent, as the Pope has done with his fool's laws, then you must in no wise allow yourself to be drawn away from the liberty. Like I said, talking about the rules in the Roman Church about what you could eat and what you couldn't eat. About dealing with Christian freedom in those things. Fifth sermon, Thursday, Reformation in connection with the sacraments. So he's going to talk quite a bit about the sacrament. In this sermon, he talks about having both kinds. Although I hold that it's necessary that the sacrament should be received in both kinds, according to the institution of the Lord, nevertheless, it must not be made compulsory or general law. We must rather promote and practice and preach the word, and then afterwards leave the result and execution of it entirely to the word, giving everyone his freedom in this matter. And when they were ready to receive the cup, they would. They were free to. It was Jesus' command. When this is not done, the sacrament becomes for me an outward work and a hypocrisy, which is just what the devil wants. And at the end, this is enough for today. Tomorrow we shall say more. Come back on Friday. Talks about sacrament for those who prepared, faith necessary for worthy reception. Again, this one's very short, just a couple of pages. Those who are most worthy, those who are constantly being assailed. So he's talking about who's prepared, who's worthy to receive the sacrament. It says those who are being assailed by death and the devil, they are the ones to whom it is most opportunely given, in order that they may remember and firmly believe that nothing can harm them, since they now have with them him from whom none can pluck them away. Let come death, devil, or sin, they cannot harm them. To write in a beautiful way what in this case, the sacrament of the altar gives to people. For this bread is a comfort for the sorrowing, a healing for the sick, a life for the dying, a food for all the hungry, and a rich treasure for all the poor and needy. And Let this be enough. Then he comes on Saturday. What else? More about the sacrament. Even shorter sermon. If you will not love one another, God will send a great plague upon you. Let this be a warning to you, for God will not have his word revealed and preached in vain. You are tempting God too far, my friends. For if in times past someone had preached the word to our forefathers, they would perhaps have acted differently. Or if it were preached even now to many poor children in the cloisters, they would receive it more joyfully than you. You are not heeding it at all, and you are playing around with all kinds of tomfoolery, which does not amount to anything. So, like while he was not dealing with the calling out the agitators, he's preaching to all the people, including that they need to listen. So then the last one on the next Sunday, he's talking. He says, "We've heard all the things which ought to be considered here, except confession. On this we will now speak." So he's talking about confession. That is confession and absolution. And he says, well, there's different kinds. He says there's three different kinds. There's the confession before God. When someone committed a sin publicly, he was accused before the congregation. If he abandoned his sin, they interceded with God, and so he's describing that. And then third was the kind to a brother, to a pastor. And he says, then this is the one in which one takes another aside and tells him what troubles him, so that one may hear from him a word of comfort. And this confession is commanded by the Pope. This is urging and forcing, which I condemned when I wrote concerning confession. And I refuse to go to confession simply because the Pope has commanded it and insists upon it. So it says you cannot force it. It cannot be like he's mad at the Pope for making it a law, right? For I wish him to keep his hands off the confession and not make of it a compulsion or command, which he has not the power to do. Nevertheless, I will allow no man to take private confession away from me. I would not give it up for all the treasures in the world, since I know what comfort and strength he has given me. See how strongly he says, no man is going to force me to go, but no man is going to keep it away from me either. And no one's going to say, I can't. No one knows what it can do for him except the one who has struggled often and long with the devil. Yea, the devil would have slain me long ago if the confession had not sustained me. For there are many doubtful matters which a man cannot resolve or find the answers to by himself. So he takes his brother aside and tells him his trouble. I mean, anyway, in my work as a pastor, I run this all the time. When people who don't, doubtful things which a man cannot resolve on his own, only because he's wrestling. Did I do what was right? Or what? How do I understand this thing whether that was that I've done or that I am or whatever it is. So he takes his brother aside. What harm is there if he humbles himself a little before his neighbor, puts himself to shame, looks for a word of comfort from him, accepts it, believes it, as if he were hearing it from God himself? As we read in Matthew 18, if two of you agree about anything they ask, it will be done for him. Moreover, we must have many absolutions, so that we may strengthen our timid consciences and despairing hearts against the devil and against God. So like there's many absolutions. We can read in the scripture about the forgiveness of sins, and we can hear it. They didn't have what we have, like a confession absolution church. You can hear the absolution there. You can hear the absolution in the sermon. This we need all of it. We need as much as we can get. Therefore, no man should forbid the confession, nor keep or draw anyone away from it. And if anyone is wrestling with his sins or wants to be rid of them and desires a sure word on the matter, let him go and confess to another in secret and accept what he says to him as if God himself had spoken it through the mouth of this person. However, one who has a strong, firm faith that his sins are forgiven may let this confession go and confess to God alone. But how many have such strong faith? Therefore, as I have said, I will not let this private confession be taken from me. But I will not have anybody forced to it, but left to each one's free will. For our God, the God we have, is not so niggardly that he has left us with only one comfort or strengthening for our conscience, or only one absolution. But we have many absolutions in the gospel, and we are richly showered with many absolutions. For instance, we have this in the gospel. If you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Another comfort we have in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses, etc. A third is in our baptism, when I reason thus, See, my Lord, I have been baptized in thy name, so that I may be assured of thy grace and mercy. And then we have private confession, when I go and receive a sure absolution, as if God himself spoke it, so that I may be assured that my sins are forgiven. Finally, I take to myself the blessed sacrament, when I eat his body and drink his blood as a sign that I am rid of my sins and God has freed me from all my frailties. And in order to make me sure of all this, he gives me his body to eat and his blood to drink, so that I shall not and cannot doubt that I have a gracious God. Thus you see that confession must not be despised, but that it is a comforting thing. And since we need many absolutions and assurances, because we must fight against the devil, death, hell, and sin, we must not allow any of our weapons to be taken away, but keep intact the whole armor and equipment which God has given us to use against our enemies. For you do not yet know what labor it costs to fight with the devil and overcome him. But I know it well, for I have eaten a bit of salt or two with him. I know him well, and he knows me well too. If you had known him, you would not have rejected confession in this way. I commend you to God. Amen. That's the end of his Invocavit service. I love that line. We must not allow any weapon to be taken from us. And he describes all these absolutions, all the different ways that God would remind us, assure us, give us, strengthen us. There's all these different weapons against the devil, because the devil has a lot of weapons too. Different ways of getting into our thoughts and causing us to doubt. And it says, well, I've got this, I've got one weapon in the sacrament of the altar. And I've got one weapon when I read in the scriptures. I've got one weapon in the Lord's Prayer, and I've got another weapon. These are all defenses. And he extols this particular one. And just saying, and if we understand this whole business of wrestling with the devil, because the devil is trying, if we think that he's not, that's exactly what C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters, like describing the devil trying to tempt us as his best temptation for us is to get us to think he's not doing anything. The best temptation for him is to think that he doesn't exist. Like that's this demon's trying to encourage other demons. Just get him to think that you don't exist, then you win, because then he's a sitting duck. Yeah, and said to Luther, where he's saying, I've met him, and I need every weapon. Or even for him, like if I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't have this, as he says. Like I need him, need everything like that is given to me. Got like maybe a half a minute. Anything? Question?
Yes, you said pastor, and he's been giving some sermons. Did he ever shepherd the church, or was he more like a guest?
Well, so his official position is as professor, and so he does. He mostly fill in. He's preaching like here at I guess I should have checked. Assuming that this is in the city church, so he was given the pulpit when he, like in this case, he comes back to address people, and he preached all the time. But I don't know that there wasn't just the city church. There was also in the monastery itself. There's daily services going on both in the churches and but he wasn't ever like the pastor. He did sometimes fill in, and he would have also filled in some of those other duties, pastoral duties, like he was hearing confessions. That's how the whole like indulgence thing come, because he's got people coming to confession and they're saying, I don't need to repent because I've got this. And he was hearing that, so that in that pastoral care moment, he has to deal publicly with that. But officially, he's never like pastor of a place. Yeah, because like Bugenhagen was the pastor for most of this time. Nothing else? We'll close with